So I want to welcome everybody to the Canadian Students for Sensible Drug Policy event, Support, Don't Punish.
No.
My name is Shay. I work for the Canadian Drug Policy Coalition, and I'm helping to start us off. The event today is a Canadian Youth Talking, Support, Don't Punish. It looks like Donald MacPherson has joined us. We are going to, Kira, you're right, I am going to move you to the other room. So again, loving and leaving you to go to the other space. Donald, can we hear you?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Woohoo!
Perfect.
I'm the definition of frantic at the moment, okay?
So for those of us that are on the call or on the Zoom right now, we are live streaming. We're live streaming to YouTube on the Paradigma space. I will put that link into the YouTube and hand it over to Donald.
Thank you, Shay. Welcome, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. I really don't know what to say. I've listened to the last presentation earlier, and I reflecting on how honored I have been to be involved with such a dynamic group of young people over the many years as I head towards my exit in terms of being central to certain movements. It's just amazing. The people that are being involved are involved right now and have become involved over the years and more recently. So I'm really quite moved by the panelists we have today and the events that are going on today on this very special day that we are trying to co-opt from the forces of prohibition and punishment. June 26th was traditionally a day when countries did such abhorrent things as public executions and horrible things to people who use drugs, people who sold drugs, and that still goes on in many countries today. Before I go any further, I want to do, I'm sitting on the unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples, including the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh. And at this point in history, given how rooted in colonialism our drug policies are, it is absolutely essential to recognize the tremendous harms that colonization around the world has had on cultures of people who have used substances over the years. And certainly we see the devastation that our policies historically have impacted Indigenous peoples in Canada. And it continues to be an unfolding disaster, our drug policies. So I'm Donald MacPherson, the Executive Director of the Canadian Drug Policy Coalition. We're a national coalition in Canada made up of 50+ organizations working to improve Canada's approach to drugs. Our policy priorities are achieving legal regulation of all psychoactive substances in the longer term, maybe the medium term, and decriminalization of possession of substances for personal use, and scaling up of harm reduction across the country wherever it is needed. And it's a real pleasure to have this panel who Shay is putting up her hand. That means I'm very used to that because Shay stops me often when I get things wrong.
I have 3 housekeeping pieces.
Oh.
Can we introduce Sophie or have Sophie introduced so we can make sure that folks who need translation are up and running?
Okay, I thought you'd done that because I was outside the room for so long, but go ahead.
We had not. And so there's Sophie.
Hi everyone, bonjour tout le monde. So I'm offering a simultaneous interpretation today. In order to access it, you can click on CC, the closed captioning at the bottom of your screen, or activate closed captioning in your app settings if you're on a phone or a tablet. If anyone wants to contribute in French, I'll be able to write in English, and I'll be interpreting the English into French. I'll give the same instructions in French as well. Alors, bonjour tout le monde. Moi, j'offre l'interprétation aujourd'hui. Donc, j'écris l'interprétation de l'anglais au français ou du français à l'anglais. Alors, si vous voulez contribuer en français, vous pouvez le faire et ça va être interprété. Pour activer l'interprétation, vous pouvez cliquer sur CC en bas de l'écran. Ça va vous permettre d'activer le sous-titrage ou d'avoir une fenêtre qui apparaît sur le côté où vous pouvez voir l'interprétation. Si vous êtes sur une application, vous devez rentrer dans vos paramètres pour activer le sous-titrage. Alors voilà, bonne rencontre. Sorry, I forgot to wrap it up in English, but I'm done with my presentation, so thank you very much. I hand it back over. Sorry.
So just a couple other housekeeping. If people have questions, you can use the Q&A. You can also upvote questions if you think they're spectacular. Natasha from the Canadian Association of People Who Use Drugs, who will wave, is going to be just making sure and keeping an eye on the Zoom webinar chat. And my name is Shay, as Donald mentioned, and myself as well, is that if you have any technical issues or any other tricky problems, I'm your go-to girl. Natasha, go-to woman. Natasha and I are going to take our video down so that we don't muck up all the brilliance that is you. So I'll hand you back to Donald, and thanks for letting me interrupt with housekeeping, Donald.
No problem, Shay. And thank you, Shay. And thank you, Natasha and Sophie, for helping to make this event keep it on the rails, and you got me back in the room. My Support Don't Punish t-shirt is social distancing today. It's locked in an office. I inadvertently left it at work. So I'm wearing my Fix Overdose Prevention Society t-shirt that are beautiful. I always want to give a shout out to Fix and the great folks in Nova Scotia that do such good work, including Natasha there. And so let me introduce our panelists, and so we can get going. I'd like to start with Iye Sanneh. I hope I'm saying your name properly. It's such a pleasure to meet you. I'm going to read a little bit of the bios, maybe not all of them. Some are longer than others, but Iye is a harm reduction outreach worker who works for Parkdale Health Center, offering satellite services in the community of West End High Park area. Used to live in Parkdale myself. She's also an outreach worker with Black Cap, offering outreach to Afro-Carib individuals in downtown and North End, West End of the city. And Fred Victor Mission as well, needle exchange, needle cleanup. Iye has a wealth of experience in harm reduction with substance use, playing a role as a woman of color in the activist world, attending international conferences such as the Portuguese Harm Reduction Conference. Iye identifies as someone with lived experience, who has been abstinent for about 1 year and 7 months, and harm reduction saved her life, according to Iye, which is amazing to hear. She also has experience with the treatment system, being on Suboxone, and would like to bring more information about this type of treatment and what it has done for her personally as someone who has been dependent on opioid pain relief since 2008. Really pleasure to meet you, Iye, and thank you for agreeing to participate on this panel. Grace, hello Grace. It's a pleasure to meet you as well. Grace is a fifth-year undergraduate student in microbiology and public health at the University of British Columbia. She's worked at the BC Centre for Substance Use and Centre for Health Evaluation and Outcome Sciences. She's a novice member of CSSDP's Vancouver chapter and jumping in the deep end, so thank you for that. And she is interested in journalism, ethics, and how the media portrays substance use. And Emily Wadden, who I've met recently on Zoom. The drug policy, our coalition has not had great representation from Newfoundland and Labrador, and mostly due to our ineptness, nothing to do with you guys. And we recently met Emily, and we're so delighted that she began to participate in some of our Zoom calls and on our Safe Supply working group. Emily Wadden is a registered social worker with the AIDS community of Newfoundland and Labrador, and is currently the program manager for the SafeWorks Access Program, SWAP. Newfoundland's needle distribution, harm reduction, and take-home naloxone training and education program. Emily has been with SWAP full-time since August 2019, previously working as a social worker in the areas of mental health, addictions, and corrections with the Justice Program. While completing her undergrad at Memorial University of Newfoundland, Emily helped revamp Memorial University's CSSDP chapter under Dr. Christopher Smith's guidance and passion. Christopher is an amazingly passionate person when it comes to this subject. And Memorial University's chapter remains active to date. So welcome, Emily, and again, delighted to have you all participating in this event.
Thanks, Donald.
I'm not sure who was meant to start.
It wasn't me. I know it's not me.
Okay,
I believe it's Iye, Donald.
Iye, okay, thank you.
So, okay, so I just want to say hi to everybody. I'm really glad and happy to be a part of this, especially because we are mainly speaking to youth and about youth and stuff. So I'm pretty much going to talk just about my time and how I got to harm reduction, saving my life, and my experience with care and how that kind of formulated into that. So basically in grade 9, I was in art school, and I was doing a lot of mushrooms and smoking a lot of pot, and the only class I would go to was art class. And basically my teachers I remember my teachers pulling my mom in one day and just saying, you know, like, Iye's very articulate, she's very smart.
We can't hear you, Iye. Can you hear us? Perhaps if you turn your video off, that might help.
Okay, hold on. Let me see if
We got you.
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Yes.
Yeah? Okay.
You froze. So
I froze. It's a weird connection. I'm on the 22nd floor, so it should be good connection, but it's actually crappy.
Okay.
So from high school, I remember the day that they pulled my mom inside and they said, you know, she seems to go to every class, doesn't go to any classes but art class. And, you know, we're very concerned with her substance dependencies with mushrooms and weed and acid and all of that. And so from there, instead of asking me what I needed, what
You've frozen again, Iye. Can you hear us, Iye?
Yeah, I can hear you, but what I can do is I can stop my, do you want me to stop my video?
Try that. Try that.
Okay. Is the video stopped?
I
Yeah.
stopped it for you.
Okay, perfect. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So from high school, I was basically sent to a day treatment school program, and it was for teen kids in high school who had substance issues and couldn't function in a normal classroom setting and not be under the influence of any kind. And that included weed, mushrooms, acid, Molly, you name it. So I went to his hospital and
We've lost you again, IE.
happening because this will suck. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
It works for a while and then it stops.
And
Let's
then
see.
it stopped.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'll try to talk fast and clear. So from that program, I ended up meeting other substance users, and from some of them I'm still friends with to this day. I didn't really get anything from going to that school. The school was pretty traumatizing, being in a hospital setting and being on the same ward as the eating disorder ward. So it was pretty traumatizing going to school every day. So through that, they basically said, you know, you're not really excelling in this program. You're kind of just doing what you want to do, and you've just made other good friends that are other substance users. And so from there, my mom kind of had two choices. It was, okay, well, let's switch schools and you can try something different. Or because I work so much, my mother being a single mom of 3 kids, let's try involving CAS and see, you know, what can we do with them? What do they suggest? So one of the things that they suggested was sending me to Aurelia, to Portage Rehabilitation Center. And through that center, there was a lot that happened. The way they ran their center was very much so like a level system. So you would start and you'd come in and they would say, okay, these are the rules. And, you know, the next level up is called a communicator. And so let's say, so we would get 3 cigarettes a day, and it was one after each meal. If they felt that, you know, we weren't listening or we were being bad in their eyes, then they would pull our cigarettes. They would do basically where if you, let's say, got a temporary pass and you snuck a pack of cigarettes in, they would have you stand up in front of the whole center, which was probably around, I would say, 60 to 70 people. And they would basically rip you to shreds. And then they would call it build you back up. And part of their teaching was that, you know, if you are a substance user, you are sneaky, you are a liar, you are untrustworthy, and that's why you're here. So we want to fix you so we can send you back home. So through that, I didn't end up graduating from the program. I ended up staying for about, I want to say, close to a year, which the average person stays about 7 to 8 months. And then I was so angry at being within that facility that I said, when it was time for a CAS review, my mom said, okay, you're ready to come home now. You're cured. And I said, I'm not coming home. I don't want to come home. I would rather go to a group home than come home. I can't believe you sent me to this place. It was pretty damaging. And so from that, I ended up going to a group home. Now, the group home that I went to was a privatized group home, and it was an all-girls group home. And again, they had these systems where, punishment, if you were late, what they called it was room time. And so they would say, okay, you were late, you get half an hour room time. So that means you're pretty much a solitary confinement, but you're in your room. So you have the radio, you have your posters, you can do whatever you want in your room, but you have to stay in your room. Now, somebody like me who's very vivacious, very outspoken, I've had history with authoritative, issues around that. I would just go on a rampage. And it was from that, the numbers would start to build. So it would be half an hour. Now you have 4 hours in your room. Now you have 8 hours. Now you have 12 hours. It got to the point where I think I racked up about 6 months room time. And so the only time you were allowed out of your room was for dinner. You could make one phone call, and it was only to your family. And then from there, that is where I started to develop my dependency with alcoholism and substance use around alcohol. Because what I would do is I would leave, I would go to school, I would go to the liquor store, I would hit up my weed dealer and get my cigarettes, and I would go home because I knew I was spending time alone in my room anyway. So because of that and the trauma of being in the center and how they were, and then the group home structure, I ended up becoming very dependent on alcohol. And just through that, it was never asked to me, what do you want? The only time they ever asked me that was when I was switched from Portage Rehabilitation Center to the group home. And that was just the worker, I guess, doing her plan of like, what do we do with this teenager that seems to be so out of control with her substance use, right? So the years went on, and I eventually got kicked out of my group home for breaking into the drug cabinet and selling drugs at school. And that would be where I started my career in drug dealing. And then from there, I went to other group homes, and then again, getting kicked out. And then I had little stints where I would stay with my family. But because of my alcohol use and because of the authoritative kind of structure that my mom was like, you're cured. You should be cured by now. You've had group homes and treatment centers and all of, like you should be cured pretty much. And so from that, I basically had, I want to say at least nine years of a pretty rough time with alcohol, substance use. I was really heavy into the rave scene. I met a guy who was an ecstasy dealer and maker, and my job was to bring in the pills while he bring in the records. And so from that was where I started, experimenting and using Molly. Back then we called it MDMA, ecstasy, liquid G. And then from that, I would have stints of, getting arrested, waking up in the drunk tank. My options for court, every time I was sent to court, it was, okay, we'll send her to rehab. So I went to Gene Tweed. I went to, I think it was oh man, I'm getting a blank on names. Names aren't important, but a lot of the times what happened was that I was going to these treatment facilities where there was no people of color. So I was the only person of color, including staff. When you're accepted into a rehabilitation center, they usually have like a write-up of your history. And so because there was so much incarceration and, being not a thin, small woman, I was always met with you're being aggressive, you're being aggressive. I was no more aggressive than the average person that was there, or the other white woman that was sitting next to me that was not agreeing with the 12 steps. A lot of the treatment centers only go on AA and NA models. And so I just had a really hard time. And it was really hard for me to accept, going through that and being that youth and being that person and, saying, well, okay, I'll stop drinking, but I still want to smoke a joint. Like, I still should be able to smoke a joint. Like, it's not a big deal, right? And then in 2008, I was assaulted by the police. And when I was assaulted by the police, they actually slipped discs in my back, and they beat me up pretty bad. And from that was when I was introduced to morphine supply, oxycodone, Tylenol 3s, Percocets. Like, I was given a galore of them. And then what happened was they said, oh, well, that's enough now. And from there, I just basically decided, well, then I'll just keep drinking. And now my drinking got worse and worse and worse. And then I was using my drinking as a reliever for pain. And I had a lot of, there was some sexual abuse stuff that happened while being intoxicated and, trauma. And I was never, ever met with a, trauma healing and wellness around my trauma. It was very, well, let's do the 12 steps and let's do this and let's do that. And I want to say that the reason why harm reduction saved my life is because I was introduced to a counselor who is very harm reduction informed and harm reduction supportive, that when I went to see her, she said, okay, so you drink every day. How many days a week do you realistically think you can stop or can't drink? And I said, none. And she said, okay, I'll see you next week. And I said, all right. And I came back next week. There was no shame. There was no guilt. There was no highlighting of, well, that's unacceptable and you need to be able to go at least a couple of days. It was just, I'll see you next week. So then I went the next week, and the next week was the hardest week because it was where I unpacked my shit, as I like to say. And it was where I had a woman in front of me who validated all of my trauma, all of my experiences in rehabilitation centers that were unhealthy. And it was there that I built a relationship with her, that I trusted her. And I felt, wow, this woman actually cares about me, And from that, I said, I think I can go one day without drinking. I think I'm going to try one day. And through the one day, it was really hard, and but I did it. And when I came back to her office the following week, she praised me again and told me how great I was for not drinking that one day and how amazing. And, you know, with the substance use, that's not a concern. The concern is the alcohol, because that's what gets you into fights. That's what gets you in the drunk tank. That's what gets you, you know, waking up and not knowing where you are. So from that, we worked on the model of harm reduction, reducing the harm of my alcohol, where it went from 1 day to 2 days to 3 days to a full week where I was able to not drink. Then was when I started to feel the pain and the pain from my back. And that was when the doctors decided, okay, well, we'll give you morphine and we'll see how this works. It's been a couple years since you've been on it, and let's see. So they started giving me the morphine, and I was doing the morphine. And then in that, I realized there's only a short amount of time that you can be on these pills before you're dependent, physically dependent on them. And they don't really tell you that much about that. Like, you know, like, oh yeah, you could get addicted. But to say, okay, after 10 or 15 days, you will literally be dependent on this drug. And if you don't take it, you will get sweats, you will get this, you will get that, was a mind blow to me. And that's when I started to, you know, do my own little street injection kind of thing, because they basically said, you know, we're going to cut you off from these scripts. Like, they're just not working, you know, like you've had so much damage to your back that they're just not working. So I turned to the streets, and I was doing injecting oxys, morphine, and Dilaudid. And then, but while I was still working on my alcohol substance use, and it got me down to the point where I was only drinking on the weekends. So the hardest part for me was getting through the weekends, because I had friends calling me saying, hey, what are you doing? Hey, what are you doing? Come over, come over. And so me and her came up with a plan that instead of me, you know, stopping to drink, why don't I get a weekend job? And so because I'm an artist, she suggested me applying for galleries, art stores, you know, maybe shadowing a photographer, photography assistant, anything like that. So in that, I ended up getting a job at Curry's, and I was still drinking and I was still using, but I got a handle of it. And I think it was the highlight and the praise of me going back to see her, and her just praising me and saying, it's okay if you're you know, shooting up and you're doing that. Our focus is the alcohol. That is what our focus is. And from that, I basically have been abstinent now from alcohol for a year and almost 7 months. And in that, she had told me, you don't need to suffer anymore. There is stuff that is out there that does have pain properties. And that's why I'm on Suboxone, because I already had felt myself with injection kind of getting out of control. I felt myself kind of going down this rabbit hole. And I said, I don't really want to do that. I really just want to take one pill and just be okay. I don't want to shoot up. I'm only shooting up because I have to, because you guys have cut my scripts. And in that, I ended up getting in touch with the doctor, who is a Suboxone, well-known in Suboxone. And through that, never been better.
Wow. Iye, it's an amazing story. Will, Iye, are you still there?
Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Yes.
I'm just saying.
So,
Were you finished? I was going to move on to
yes. So the ending part is that I
Okay.
just feel happy to be here, happy to share my story, and I feel really great to be a part of Kaput. And I am 100% down for harm reduction. And I hope that we can get safe supply because we need it. It is very much needed. And I'm really happy. And that's all. I'm done for today.
Wow, that's an amazing story, Iye. And there may be some questions, so you may not be done for today. But we'll go to.
Oh, okay.
Well, we're going to do the questions after everyone speaks. So
Okay.
So hang out with us. We're going to go to Grace next.
Hi. So I just wanted to start off by thanking Iye for sharing that really important perspective as someone with lived experience. For my talk today, I'm offering the perspective as someone who is a loved one of someone who uses substances and someone generally interested in the way we think about substance use as students. So I'd like to kind of walk you through an informal case study of a poster campaign that was done at my university. So I go to UBC, which is the University of British Columbia. And this poster campaign that I'll be kind of reflecting on is one of our most well-known harm reduction campaigns to date. And I'd argue that overall, UBC as a university is really trying to be progressive in relation to substance use policy. We have a student-run organization that's currently being restructured called Vice, and they offer community outreach and education initiatives through hosting things like public naloxone Narcan trainings, and even a joint rolling workshop, which was surprisingly less controversial than I had expected it to be. There's also a group for women living with addiction and recovery called Students Recovery, which was remarkable because it was one of the first of its kind in Canada. And the way that I read this as a student who sees that these supports are available is, I think the university is trying to say that if you're a student and you need help in education, then that help is out there. But even with these really great efforts, we still have some major gaps that kind of point to the need for all universities to think about what they can do to improve the continuum of support for substance use. So digressing a little bit, the best year of my life in my university career so far was when I worked as a residence advisor. So residence advisors also go by residence dons, house fellows, community assistants. And the thing that kind of all of these positions have in common is they provide live-in support to thousands of students who live in residence on campuses. So we're there to listen after a particularly stressful exam, or we're there to help mediate roommate conflict. But what I suspect most importantly from the administration standpoint is we're there to enforce residence policies around substance use and parties. So one of the ways that UBC residents tried to advance their own residence policies in light of legalization of cannabis a few years ago was by launching this poster campaign called Love Your Brain, that's loosely based on some of the Canadian low risk guidelines for using cannabis for young adults, but with some kind of additions and extrapolations that are a little bit problematic that kind of undermine its credibility as harm reduction material. And it was so well regarded that it won some major North American marketing awards. And it's been popularized to the point where it's expanded into Simon Fraser University, and probably even a university near you, given how proudly the creators of this campaign spoke about that campaign. So I have some images from the campaign here. I'm just going to figure out how to share my screen. Okay, hopefully you can see what's being broadcasted on my screen right now. So this is the Love Your Brain campaign, features this kind of lovable brain cartoon, but some of the messages and the images that it pushes are questionable. This very first one is this brain falling asleep while it's doing homework or studying. And the caption is, frequent cannabis use can have a lasting effect on your concentration, memory, and IQ. And this kind of can be interpreted as playing into that low achieving, lazy stereotype that we're already very familiar with associating with cannabis use. This one I think is just silly. It's a brain in a lettuce, and it points out some of the short-term effects of cannabis, which are paranoia. So this is valid, but still a little bit silly. There's this one, chilling on my couch, didn't get high. And there is this, in this poster, the brain is lounging on this tropical island, and it's enjoying an ice cream cone and sunbathing. And the caption is, spend your money wisely because cannabis use is linked to increased debt and lower income. So what we're starting to appreciate now, in light of the growing body of literature in cannabis use, is that this relationship is sometimes bidirectional. So sometimes, like, maybe a more nuanced interpretation of this is, sure, some people find that cannabis use leads them to have lower income, but the reverse is also true, where some people start off with lower income and they find themselves, they have their own motivations for cannabis use. So I think the implications here are a little bit problematic. This is basically saying, why would you spend your hard-earned dollars on using cannabis when you can go on vacation instead, which is questionable. But so this campaign is not without its, this campaign has some strengths as well. For example, I really like this one, which is know how to refuse as a tip. So prepare a few stock phrases in advance, even a simple no thanks or I'm finished tonight. So this kind of addresses that peer pressure to use cannabis component and helps you politely turn away helps you politely stay on track with your intended cannabis use for the night. But it also offers some really not helpful information, like consider avoiding if you're under 25. When the reality is the median age of the student who's seeing this poster in residence is much younger than 25. So these are mostly younger undergraduate students who are seeing this poster information. So I don't know about you, but I don't think it's a very valid harm reduction strategy to suggest to someone consider avoiding using. So I'll stop sharing now. Let me get reoriented. Okay, so based on the feedback that I had heard from my community about that campaign, so this was feedback from my own residents, my peer residence advisors, and members from CSSDP Vancouver. What we decided was that some of these messages can be pretty harmful for stereotyping what drug use and specifically cannabis use looks like. So those images of being financially irresponsible, lazy, low achieving, or stoner, these are stereotypes that the media already pushes, and it's not really useful images for us. So it's disappointing when one of the most well-regarded and one of the most prominent harm reduction materials that we as students have seen to date were developed by student housing who clearly have interests in minimizing cannabis use on their property by promoting some of these negative messages and messages that might end up impacting how someone decides to reach out for help if they're not happy about their cannabis use. So I'll note that the project team consisted of 3 residence housing staff and 1 illustrator. So there was no person from student health and wellness, no substance use expert was involved in leading the project. There was also clearly an absence of student consultation because from what I understand, they pulled 1 student from the only substance use related group on campus, and that was the extent of student consultation here. So it makes sense because residents clearly acted in their own interests. So the campaign does what they intended it to do. But when we promote like these types of messages as a harm reduction tool, because this campaign was so self-serving, it points to the need for to involve experts to help lead the visuals and messages to help avoid the possibility of promoting harms and setting this perception of maybe yourself or your peers about using substances and maybe impacting the way you reach out into the community if you're not happy about your substance use. Because the way that I've learned harm reduction from CSSDP and from my workplaces is a harm reduction technique is more along the lines of like for students, if you decide to use, try to use in an environment where you feel safe because there are possibly side effects like psychosis. And it's not something like consider avoiding it if you're under 25. Or using too much will make you poor because these types of messages aren't helpful. They're not new knowledge and they're definitely not harm reduction. And because of how universities are trying to move towards harm reduction concepts, this campaign is an example of how universities might really try to do well by supporting some of their small student-led organizations. So Vice and Students Recovery, but they might miss the point with a student body that's as large as residents. So what it really emphasizes is we need to involve these experts in substance use and people with lived experience and students, not just when we want to, and not just confined to these small student groups, but in these common spaces like residence life. And I think it also encourages young people to help kind of fight current drug policies by reading between the lines and looking for these gaps and in these efforts to help improve substance use policies and practices. And that's all I had for today. I'm happy to take questions after Emily, but thank you for listening.
Thank you, Grace, for that really interesting critique of something so present in housing at UBC. I was thinking maybe they're more to show that they're the families and parents who are paying the bills, that they're sort of anti-drug. Now we'll move to, so I have some thoughts on that. We'll get into that in the questions later. And yes, please use the Q&A if you want to start asking questions for people. We'll keep track of them. Emily Wadden, are you ready?
Good to go. Good to go, Donald. Good to go. Thank you. Thank you to those both before me. It was super interesting, I have to say. So as noted at the beginning, my name's Emily M, whatever you choose to call me, and I'm from Newfoundland and Labrador. I feel like I need to kind of give people a little bit of background about Newfoundland and Labrador because we are a very, we can be categorized as an odd and unique place. So yeah, I feel like a little background info wouldn't go astray, just to give some kind of context here, like geographically about what we deal with. And also worth noting, I come from the perspective of someone who continues to have lived and living experience of both drugs and mental illness, and is also professionally a social worker working in this field. So I guess I'm speaking off, kind of a mixture of personal and professional experiences. So yeah, so although Newfoundland and Labrador is one province, we are actually separated by the Atlantic Ocean. So Labrador is on the mainland and it borders with Quebec. And Newfoundland itself is a rock in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. Labrador even has its own time zone, but again, we are all one province. So it's also worth noting that half of our total population, like of Newfoundland and Labrador, lives in the capital city, which is where I am right now, St. John's, and surrounding areas. So there's a couple surrounding areas, suburbs, whatever. And about half of our population lives there, and the other half lives in the rest of both Newfoundland and Labrador. So this essentially means that we have communities with, that might have 10 people in it. We have communities that might have 100 people in it. We have tens of thousands of people in our province who have never seen a person of any color, have never seen anything other than white. So we are an exceptionally whitewashed island. While there is we do have the same relative challenge with criminalizing Indigenous folk, particularly in Labrador, where they do have a correctional center, but also separating them from their culture and bringing them here. However, in terms of criminalization of colored individuals, it is not a massive thing here, simply because there's just not that much diversity. Like, there is some, don't get me wrong, and racism does exist within that, but as a province as a whole, we are exceptionally white. So I feel like that's worth noting. So yeah, let me just get recentered on my notes. So yeah, so even last year in 2019, we hired our first Black police officers, and that was the highlight of the news, and that was in 2019. So that's just to give you a little bit of background on Newfoundland and Labrador. So in Newfoundland and Labrador, we have a local police force known as the Royal Newfoundland Constabulary, or the RNC, and they are located in 3 or 4 bigger areas, both on the island in Newfoundland and in Labrador. And then we have the RCMP, who essentially will enforce the law in every community in between. So everything that's considered, essentially everything other than those 4 or 5 communities that the RNC patrol, the RCMP has the rest. Like, it is very common for people in rural communities to say, post on Facebook that, oh, the RCMP is in town, so then everyone in the community knows. So yeah, just a bit more background. So in NL, it seems, and NL, like, I mean Newfoundland and Labrador, but we just abbreviate it to make it less annoying. So in NL, essentially it seems as though everybody is somebody's sister's cousin's dog's friend. Like, most people are, connected in some ways, and this is no different for our police force. So because, I guess, of the local, attributes, most of our police force is local, and most of them choose to stay local. So we do not have very much turnaround in our police force, our local police force. And because of this, we, both as our community organization and many other community organizations, have been able to build actually quite strong relationships with both the RNC and RCMP. About 2-3 years ago, the RNC, which again, Royal Newfoundland Constabulary, decided that they were no longer going to criminalize the use of personal possession for drugs. Now, I'm not saying that that has occurred 100% in the last 2 or 3 years, but from someone who had to look at the court docket every single day for 1.5 years in my previous job, to someone who still looks to see, what's on the go, I've actually never seen a charge for simple possession. we seem to only be criminalizing individuals who have drugs with the intent to sell. Typically, our police force focuses on larger busts, and every few months they come out to the media with, we have a bust of drugs, guns, money, etc. And that's typically how that works. It got to a point for our police where they didn't want to waste their time anymore, and they came to us and they said, we need your help. We don't know what to tell people or where to go, but we're sick and tired of bringing them to the lockup because that's not where they need to be. So, we have made sure that all of their squad cars are equipped with info cards, everything ranging from like the shelter lines to the meals to everything like that around town, so that both, the police and people that they're serving, whether it be on the street or house calls, can get the information. And I have to say the RNC, they've been good partners in that. I also want to greatly acknowledge that there are many challenges and problems with the RNC, and I'm in no way saying that they are not without immense issues. It's just important to note, as I get into my next section, that it is more our mental health system actually that is doing the vast majority of criminalization for people who use drugs and or have mental illness, etc. So yeah, I will move on from the police. And yeah, because honestly, we don't have a large problem with them. And I'm clearly, like me, I'm a privileged individual. I'm educated, I'm white. And I've also worked with a whole lot of people in corrections who fit none of those demographics and have still seen them interact with the police in non-negative ways. Again, not saying that that's always the case. It is absolutely not. We are by far, we do not have a perfect police department by far. So I just want to make that very clear that like, I'm not on a cloud where the police are great here. Really, so we have a hospital in Newfoundland, and it is infamously known, well, it's named, but it is known as the Waterford Hospital. So this hospital opened its doors in 1855, and it still remains the same building to this date. Wings of this hospital have been redone, and some are simply closed due to black mold and health concerns. But it is still standing, and it is still where people go when they are in psychiatric distress. So based on that information, it's not a great place for healing. Just the sheer age of the building itself is unfortunate. I mean, they still have like keys, like the big metal keys, and sometimes pass like scan cards, but they also have keys. So like that makes no sense in and of itself. So I guess in general, like I recognize that there's times and places for police interventions during crisis, relapse, whatever, particularly here. We have a lot of cliff sides, and that has been used as a way for people to die by suicide or seriously injure themselves for years here. We have many, many, many areas you can go, etc. So, I mean, in these times and places, yes, the police are going to get you and they're going to grab you, and they are not going to allow you to harm yourself or jump. And that's grand. There's space for that. Absolutely. But I want to more touch on individuals who present themselves voluntarily to the psychiatric emergency room, or the psychiatric assessment unit as it's known, the PAU. So basically, most people, or a lot of people, they go there voluntarily. They go there because they have absolutely nowhere else to turn. Currently, right now, during COVID conditions, our treatment centers are quite full, and the one that's local and about a skip and a hop away from this location, that usually they always have beds. They are chock full with a waiting list. So as a result, more people are going to the Waterford Hospital for help. So both from what, you know, I'm gonna just be flat out and say that, you know, I've seen this happen many times, being a patient there myself recently. And so essentially people come in voluntarily for assistance, and you know, from the moment you walk in, all your cigarettes are taken and you are locked behind, I think it's 3 locked doors. I believe it's 3 locked doors right off the bat. Everything is taken from you. Your pockets are searched, everything. Then you will see a series of doctors. So you will first see a nurse, then you will see a family doctor, then you will see a psychology resident. At any time during this time, if you become slightly bit escalated, and you know, I don't mean crisis escalated, like I just mean maybe someone says something that triggers you and you get a little angry. But you know, as a social worker, none of these things that I've seen would, like, I would consider them crisis points. I would simply just sit down with that person and talk to them. However, that's not what happens, unfortunately, most times. So in these situations, typically, if you step out of line with any 3 of those individuals, you are essentially put on an involuntary hold for 72 hours, and you are no longer a voluntary patient. This in turn causes people to freak out naturally, because they walked in there willingly, genuinely wanting some assistance, and now they are held there against their will. Personally, I have been asked, like, are you going to stay in your room tonight, or do I need to lock it from the outside so that you don't come out? And I said, okay, well, that doesn't sound great. So you can keep it open. But yeah, so it doesn't take much for our hospital to involuntarily hold you should you step just the slightest bit out of line. And then there are countless stories of people being pinned down and injected with, you know, the hospital cocktail and this and that. And there's security involved. So all around, it's a fairly traumatizing experience for everybody involved, especially those who go in there willingly, of free will, who have packed a bag, want to go in the hospital, get some assistance, and are now being involuntarily held there against their will. So eventually you'll get moved up to a unit where you're only allowed 5 smokes in a day, and they're at certain times. So something about Newfoundland and Labrador, we smoke like tilts. We literally, our smoking is, it's something else. And so for anybody who smokes, 5 smokes a day isn't a whole lot, but for a Newfoundlander who smokes, that's just nonsense. So immediately people are not able to go outside when they want to go outside. They're locked up in the psychiatric hospital while they wait for a bed at another facility. Everybody is watching their every move, so they feel criminalized. They feel as though they can't even go to the bathroom, or something as simple as wanting to take a shower and staff not being able to do that. It feels very criminalized in that system. You know, from my own experience, most recently, you know, I did something that wasn't, you know, from the staff perspective, the best idea, and the staff proceeded to essentially talk crap about me and call me, you know, one bad apple has to ruin it for everybody. And at no point did anybody ask me, you know, what's happening, what's wrong. It was just like, okay, you suck, you did this, one bad apple ruins it for everybody. Let's make sure the whole unit knows that this person did something, and let's strip all their belongings. And yeah. So it's actually our mental health system that causes a whole lot of issues, and that is just one little piece of it. I have no idea how I'm doing on time, but what I would like to add just a couple more things in terms of the mental health care system. So in regards to driver's licensing, in the civil court of law, mental health or medical professionals have the most autonomy in terms of getting your license suspended or taken away. It has happened to me on more than one occasion, and the settling of the suits would have been much easier in criminal court than they were in civil court, because of the power that medical professionals have. And again, these were not justified. You know, I understand that, again, there are concerns for safety, individuals drive impaired, like I get all that stuff. And this was not the issue at that time. And I guess one last note relating to the system and criminalization, because it's not all hunky-dory, but somehow our police are the lesser of two evils. Something that happened in Newfoundland during January, there was an event called Snowmageddon, and it was basically where our entire city got over 100 centimeters of snow in 2 days, and you could not move. Roads were not passable. It took days to plow highways. The snow was up past like the height of dump trucks. So everything was inaccessible. So some clinics had set up their patients with carries of methadone and Suboxone, and some clinics simply just didn't. So that in and of itself is an issue. And unfortunately, even the clinics that did set up their people with carries, no one expected the city to be so inaccessible for so long that they didn't have enough carries. So what this resulted in was many individuals going to one of our two other medical hospitals. So we have two in the city. And essentially, people would enter because they were in severe withdrawal. Only certain pharmacies were allowed to open in the end, and just about most of them served methadone or Suboxone. So a lot of people were still going out, and I'm talking days. I'm not talking 1 day. I'm talking, 5 and 6 days where, and I mean, there was a whole load of relapses during this, clearly, because people needed to survive and live. But people were showing up at emergency rooms and just asking for methadone and Suboxone, just the regular dose, and getting the police called on them. One hospital was significantly worse than the other, and the RNC at first started answering like, hey, is this person being aggressive? Are they causing any sort of ruckus? Are there any issues here? To which the hospital staff would reply, no, they're just here looking for their methadone. So essentially, it got to the point where the police had to explicitly tell the hospital on more than one occasion that this was not a criminal issue and that it was a health issue, and that the police had no business with this and would refuse to respond, because that is just not what we do. I would also like to add very quickly, 2 seconds, that due to COVID, our local penitentiary, which typically houses at its max maybe 210 inmates, in March, they let out, I think it was just over 100 people on what became known as COVID bail. And to this date, there have been no notable increases in crime. And that's like anecdotally and factually in the community. So, I mean, that is a whole whack of evidence in and of itself. And, I will, just on a last note, like, Newfoundland and Labrador, it is a unique place with its unique challenges. While our police are far from perfect, we've been able to build significant and long-lasting relationships within both the RNC and RCMP. And clearly, unfortunately, by comparison, it's our mental health system that requires a refocusing on supporting individuals rather than punishing them. And that's all I got.
Wow, that's all. That's I
know, Donald, I could go on for days. So literally, that was me trying to not.
Yeah, so no, I appreciate that. You have saved for the resilience shining through in Iye's story and Grace's critique of stigmatizing so-called prevention or harm reduction messaging, and the resilience that you've shown. I'm actually, you could be quite traumatized just listening to how dysfunctional all three stories have in terms of trying to achieve something that's positive, or if they were well-intentioned. It's quite amazing array of issues and topics that the three of you have covered. We had we had approached Lila Attar to present. We could not nail anything down with her. She's quite an amazing young woman who has serious lived experience and did a national sort of tour a few years ago talking about her experience, and a lot of us met her then, and we hold her close as a friend of the harm reduction movement. And so in her place, because of the timing of this event and the focus of this event on youth, and some new legislation that has just been initiated in British Columbia, we're going to ask Natasha to talk about that the issue of Bill 22, I believe.
Yeah, thanks, Donald. Yeah, so I'm Natasha, and just for the viewers that don't know who I am, I'm the Executive Director of the Canadian Association of People Who Use Drugs. And our organization has been raising the voice of people who use drugs throughout the policymaking process at every level of government. And our organization strives to reduce oppressive societal conditions that people who currently or formerly use drugs face, and emphasize the need for their direct involvement in the public policy decision-making process. Yesterday or the night before, I had an email come through that was very troubling. And some of you may have heard about this. In BC on Tuesday, on June 23rd, Ministers Dix and Darcy introduced a Bill 22, which is a Mental Health Amendment Act, and into the Legislative Assembly. And it's passed the first reading, and to my knowledge is being scheduled for a second reading. The bill proposes to add a new form of detention for youth who are engaged in what the government labels as problematic substance use. There's many concerning elements about this proposed amendment, and given the severity of introducing a new form of detention, one would hope that there would be a process for careful consideration and adequate public health or public consultation. If the bill is passed, Bill 22 will authorize the detention of youth age 19 and under for up to 7 days following an overdose on the recommendation of one physician in a stabilization facility, which is totally absurd. There's no proposal to create new facilities. There's only a plan to use redesignate the facilities that are already designated under the Mental Health Act as stabilization facilities. And I'll quote Minister Darcy in her reading. She says, "Stabilization care under the Mental Health Act is intended to protect youth who present in the emergency department in the midst of an overdose and keep them safe in a designated stabilization care facility. It will allow the provision of medically necessary health care and observation for youths to recover from their overdose, and it will also allow them to regain their decision-making capacity, which is diminished in the immediate aftermath of an overdose." Very troubling. So while Bill 22 uses new terminology, specifically the stabilization care, detaining youth who are engaged in what government labels as problematic substance use is not a new idea. Secure care legislation has been in place for many years in other jurisdictions, and different forms of secure bills have been tabled repeatedly in BC, but they've never been passed. Secure care has been criticized for many reasons, including its colonial impact on Indigenous youth, the disproportionate use with girls and young women. There's no evidence whatsoever that coerced substance use treatment is effective, and it actually causes further harm and trauma, not to mention the civil liberties infringements. The proposed amendments are missing some basic safeguards as well. It doesn't ensure or hold up to the constitutional rights and doesn't promote therapeutic outcomes. It provides no right to independent hearing for a youth who want to challenge their detention. And incredibly, there's no provision for detained youth to access an independent legal advice or services of a lawyer. The representative for the children and youth and the BC Coroners Act, or BC Chief Coroner, I apologize on my mistake there, has expressed concerns that if passed, Bill 22 will have dangerous unintended consequences, including increased fatalities and deterrence for youth accessing healthcare. Furthermore, I would add that if Bill 22 is passed, it's counterintuitive to the Good Samaritan Act. And we know youth who use drugs and people who use drugs in general already don't trust emergency health services and or police. The act was put into place to promote individuals' health and well-being in the emergency response to an overdose. And the Good Samaritan Drug Overdose Act applies to anyone who seeks emergency support during an overdose, including the person experiencing the overdose. The act also protects a person who seeks help, whether they stay or leave from the overdose scene before help arrives, and the act protects anyone else who is at the scene when help arrives. But so now when you think about that in the language in the Good Samaritan Overdose Act, actually if you're a youth, it doesn't protect you. It means that if you are overdosed, we're leaving youth to have to make a decision on, in the moment, life or death. Do I call and possibly have my friend detained for 7 days? And there's no guarantee that they don't need further medical help. So I would say, from COPUD's angle, we are appalled, and bringing this kind of legislation forward is wrong in any case, but especially in the context of the public health emergencies that are converging on the population of people who use drugs specifically. And I'll note that in BC in the month of May, there was 170 overdose fatalities, and that was the highest number of overdose deaths recorded since this crisis has begun. So we have really understand that if this bill goes through, more people are going to die. And so it's outrageous to me and to my fellow Kaput people that this is even being proposed. So I guess I'll end with, I would ask everybody here that's present to please email Ministers Dix and Darcy and demand answers and adequate public consultation around this bill. Because as we know, people are going to die, they're dying at alarming rates, and this will just enforce further deaths. Thanks.
Thank you, Natasha. Yeah, certainly a very difficult time to be plopping a bill like this down into the midst of this overdose or illicit drug toxicity crisis, as our coroner in BC calls it. It seems have we lost Iye? It seems is there a way of getting a hold of her, see if she can?
It's Shay. She did laugh off, so I'm just going to promote her back into the panel. Sorry about that.
Okay. I'm going to go to the Q&A now. At the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A, little Q&A thing beside the share screen and record buttons and the closed captioning buttons. So please put questions in there. And the first question comes from Petra Schultz, and she's directing it towards Iye, but I think both Emily and Grace, I know Emily will have something to say about this for sure, being a social worker, and Grace may have something to say about it too, but it's really about what Natasha just talked about. Her question is about the new legislation, and Petra is part of Moms Stop the Harm, a national group of parents who are working to change Canada's approach to drugs as well. So her question is that advocates and parents, we are concerned about negative effects of this legislation. I'm wondering what your thoughts are and what effect such legislation would have had on you. Oh, Iye is back now. So I'm gonna repeat that last part, Iye, because I'm asking this question about the legislation that has been introduced in British Columbia. It's stabilization care in quotation marks, which is really a coerced sort of treatment. And I'm asking really all three of you, and Petra's question was, as advocates and parents, we are concerned about negative effects of this legislation. I'm wondering what your thoughts are and what effect such legislation would have had on you, Iye. So we'll start with Iye. You're muted.
Unmuted. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. So I don't believe in any uninvoluntary forced care. when people come out of overdoses, from my experience, a lot of people will say, oh, well, that's the best time to get them and get them into care and get them into rehab and you know, treatment facilities and mental health facilities. That is the worst thing you can do. I think the best thing to do is to, you know, highlight that you went through a very traumatic experience by overdosing, and you know, like, how do you feel and what's going through your head, and like what do you see moving forward? Forcing somebody into a mental health facility is wrong across the board. I feel that even if, like, I think it was M was talking and she was saying, like, going in and then, oh, now you're no longer involuntary, now you're stuck here. Well, that shouldn't be happening. You know, you should be able to walk out just like you walked in. You know, and again, like, I've had my experiences where I've gone to the hospital for self-harm and they've said, oh no, it's a suicide attempt. You should, we're going to talk about this in the other room and see if you know, you're suitable, because that self-harm was very bad. And, you know, that could be a suicide attempt. No, self-harm is different from a suicide attempt. Just like an overdose doesn't mean that you want to die. You know what I mean? So to that question, I don't believe in involuntary mental health, like any type of pushing somebody into that. And it actually brings up something, because my ex-partner, his mother, because of his substance use, she takes pictures when he nods off, and she says, oh man, I just need to get him to, like, BC or Newfoundland or somewhere where I can get him into a facility, be a crown, and he can't leave. Well, that doesn't work. It doesn't work. Just like going to rehab, even voluntary, doesn't work necessarily. You know, care, it has to be individualized for every single person is different. You know, we're all different. So why would we lump everybody in the same category and say, hey, everybody who overdoses and blah, 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 like they're just going to go right into a psych ward. And I don't know how many people have actually been in a psych ward. It is fucking traumatizing by itself. Because as soon as you raise your voice, and especially as a Black woman, there comes the crowd and they surround you, and now you're aggressive, and now we need to restrain you, and you're problematic, and you need to stay here, and we need to medicate you. You know, and that's what scares me. And a lot of people don't want to get help in terms of even just seeing a counselor, because they're worried that if they go see a counselor or they talk to somebody, that they are going to be stuck in a psych ward. Well, that shouldn't be the case. So for me, that would have killed me. That would have killed me. I would have found a way to hang myself in that mental hospital, and I wouldn't have been okay. So to your question, I don't agree. I think it should not be it should not be forced. And there needs to be more support when you go to a mental or go to a psych ward in the initial point of, how do we help you? Because I've gone to psych wards where they say, oh, well, you're on Suboxone. Well, we can't give you any lorazepams, even though you've been up and you can't sleep and you get night terrors and you have PTSD with the police. Instead, we're just going to up your antidepressants, come back next week to the drop-in and talk to the team there. No, I don't agree. So that's my answer.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Emily Wadden, I saw you shaking your fist or doing something with your hand. So
Yeah, no, I was agreeing to that as soon as
Yes.
you raise your voice, but that's not what I wanted to add. I think it's interesting because so my addiction and stuff, that all started when I was 17, and at the time we had there was no mental health or addiction facility for youth on the island at that time. There have since been 2 added, so that has been a thing, but not during my time. And my addiction at that time, and at no time, I will just make it clear, has ever been to painkillers. It's been to, I guess, most other things except psychedelics. So because of that, it's a bit different. But I have to say, as a young person, I knew pretty quickly that I wasn't in control. And there was a lot of times that I would cry and say, I wish someone could lock me up somewhere so that I could just not do this. Like, I knew that I physically couldn't go a day without using, but that I wanted to. So it's interesting because, and I don't think any of those bills they never got passed here. So even though we have a unit in a place designed for secure whatever, it doesn't actually, like, it's just used as the regular unit for that now. But I have to say, as a youth, I cried about that on more than one occasion, saying I wish that there was a place that I could go, and there wasn't. So I think that that's interesting. And now as a social worker, and when I hear the details of this bill that Natasha just read out, I find it interesting. Like, well, she pointed out stabilization, but that, like, she also mentioned something about decision making. So to me, I'm thinking, like, okay, if someone goes in there and is highly addicted to painkillers and has overdosed and is admitted and is under 19 and is forced into this 7-day thing, I mean, that's going to be 7 days of hell. Like, who is coming out of there with a clearer mind or a better brain set, or like, who is thinking better and feeling better after that? I don't see that. Like, to me, that's just the motivation of your plotting your return to how the hell can I, 1, get drugs in here, 2, escape, 3, get kicked out, and 4, who am I going to meet as soon as I walk away? So those are my, I guess, 2 differing thoughts from 2 different points in my life. But yeah, I don't see that 7 days going very well. But who knows?
Thanks, Emily. I think you've broached the complexity of the issue, because people want to help, and I think these bills that come forward from time to time over the years, I think they are well intentioned. I don't
absolutely
and I think it's always on the floor in an emergency ward in the middle of the night. It's a really complex situation often. And I think it's our job is to critique this kind of legislation so that possibly something good comes from it, or it's stopped. It's interesting that the chief coroner was out right away saying she was quite concerned in BC that this might cause more harm than good. And really wanted to see the details of it. So thank you for that. Grace, do you want to weigh in on this?
I'll quickly add in that it was surprising that it was escalated to the point where, like, we're even considering this. But when Natasha clarified that it was one physician who made the initial recommendation, I think that that will, hopefully it does get brought up to the point where there can be public consultation, because I believe that a lot of healthcare workers will also openly go against this. From what I understand from my friends who are in training programs in social work and in nursing and in occupational therapy, a lot of core principles of healthcare center around this idea of choice. And especially for young people under the age of 19, like choice is really important to them. And the way that like it comes through in their practices, even if they know in the back of their minds that they only really have 2 options to give to their patient or their client, they're going to frame that in a way that is more along the lines of, what do you think about choice A? Or how do you feel about choice B? So knowing that this is such a core part of their training to work as healthcare professionals, seeing like a bill like this possibly become passed is really alarming, and goes against a lot of, I think it forgets some of those core principles of like individualism and choice that, yeah.
Thank you, Grace. We have another, and thank you all for your answers. It is a really it's a really serious sort of piece of legislation that we will be facing, and there will be a consultation period. It sounds like. Now on to something else that's just as contentious. Is the question is again to all of you. How can we try to effectively defund the enforcement pillar and change it to a pillar of education at all levels of school and public society? I think the enforcement pillar, I think, is referring to like a 4 pillars drug strategy type of thing, like we've talked a lot about out here in Vancouver, where you have treatment, prevention, harm reduction, and policing. From my experience, we tried to acknowledge policing because of the criminalization of drugs. They're sort of in the game, whether you want them or not. They're part of the machinery of drug prohibition as it stands right now. So better to, from our point of view, back 20 years ago, better to have them in the tent than outside the tent. Now, and there is a huge movement to really look critically at what is the role of policing. As we are all aware, the Black Lives Matters movement has been incredibly effective out of a very tragic history over the last few years of people being killed by police. And so now I feel like everything's on the table for us and everybody to sort of critique the involvement of policing in this issue. So what's your response to how we can try to effectively defund the enforcement pillar and change it to a pillar of education at all levels of school and public society? Maybe we'll do the reverse order. Do you want to go, Grace?
Sure. So in my community at UBC, we now have a very local and very recent example of why we need to work on defending the police and incorporating like the people who are trained best to respond to different crises. And that example that I'm referring to involved this UBC Okanagan student named Mona Wang. And she was a nursing student, and she had a mental health crisis. And in video surveillance, you can see that her interactions with a female police officer, and I note that she's female because I think some of the controversy around defunding the police is not all police behave a certain way. So there's video footage of her being physically enduring excess physical force from this police officer, and in the aftermath, she ends up at the hospital. She's like very visibly shaken. She has scars and bruising, and a lot of all of this could have been avoided if the appropriate person responded to that type of mental health crisis. And I think a lot of the times we see defunding the police as a right and left issue, but this is, I think in my community, this was a very clear local example of how whatever your political background is, there's clearly something that needs to be done to improve public safety and those interactions with police. And one way that we're finding as students is increasingly helpful is through writing about it and speaking out through our school newspaper and similar media outlets like that. I think the interest is definitely there for students because there's been a lot of talk about defunding the police recently, and students are interested and they're listening in and they're seeking out information on to form their own opinion on defunding the police. And I think in the coming months, as we see that there are beyond just Mona Wang at UBC Okanagan, there are our undocumented interactions with police. We're going to move towards, I think, as young people, advocating for this, advocating for the defunding the police and moving resources where more upstream where they need to be, so that we don't need to rely on brutal tactics in the downstream that end up costing us a lot more in terms of hospitalizations and in terms of just social harms. Yeah.
Thank you, Grace. Emily, you spoke a fair bit about the police in your presentation, and again, the sort of complexity of working with police who you actually have good relations with in large part, acknowledging that they're not perfect by any means. What is your response to that question?
I think for us, specifically in Newfoundland and Labrador, I don't think that, yes, we definitely have those pillars, but in our specific province, I don't think that the police's budget is honestly anything to call home about. I think they're just, they have their annual budget and they struggle to get everything else just like everybody else. It seems to be that way, to be honest with you. So they are not rolling in weapons and new cars and that's just not what's happening here. So I don't know how funded they are to begin with. But what I do know is that in the past 3 years, community organizations have been receiving sizable support from the government in terms of financial support to hire a whole lot more staff and to create a whole lot more programs that typically the police would have been involved with, but that kind of mitigate their presence or their need to be present now. Like, they're not the immediate calls. So I think Newfoundland and Labrador has done some, honestly, I can just speak for literally the St. John's part. I can't even speak for Labrador, but St. John's itself has done a good job of putting up a fair few buffers between individuals themselves and the police. Like, if you're connected to any community organization, they're going to get a call that you're in need. The police themselves, the way that our previous RNC program was structured was that you had to have a degree in order to even apply first, and that only changed in the last 2 years. So just for example, 4 of our police officers now used to work here, and they've all got backgrounds in psychology and social work. So there's some, because of the way our program used to be structured, there was no way for young, power-hungry men or whoever to easily get on the force per se. However, we have now restructured the way that our police force, the way that candidates are selected and the program, and you do not have to have a degree. And we're already seeing some issues with that. And we think that it's only going to kind of get worse as more and more, guns land in the hands of people who just got out of high school and who are now in extremely authoritative roles in the community, and who are, even brain-wise, not mature enough to be so, in my opinion, humble opinion. But yeah, I mean, in the city, we've done a good job at putting some buffers between the police and the people themselves via community organizations and the mobile crisis line. But in general, like, I'm all for clearly defund the police, like community all the way. Yeah, there's no doubt about that.
Thanks, Emily. Maybe it's beginning to happen already in Newfoundland without anyone really knowing.
No, that'd be shocking, Donald. Come on, you know we're like the last for everything. Come on, we're in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. You know how we roll.
That's right. Iye, I'm sure you probably have some comment on this question of how can we try to effectively defund the enforcement pillar and change it to a pillar of education. You're muted.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. So I actually studied photojournalism for a little bit, and my grandmother was a photographer. I went to the defund police protests. I actually live in the building where Regis lived, and she fell. So it's been pretty hard to process all of this stuff for myself, the community. It's brought up so much for me. I feel like what needs to happen is that, you know, they've done this thing where they've said that they've made a mental health team that's supposed to arrive with the police or before the police. And I've actually asked some social workers from different organizations, and they've said they've had mental health people who have showed up to support a wellness check who were worse than the police. I was always taught at a young age, do not trust the police, because of I am a Black woman, and you know, I grew up in a certain area, and I could tell you from a young age, I had a babysitter who was walking my bike home. He happened to be a Black man, and the bike didn't fit in the car. He was automatically stopped, told that he stole the bike. Mom had to go bail him out. And it was like, why? You know? And it's like, oh, because you see a Black man with a brand new bike, that of course he stole it, right? So when I think of the police, I don't think of good things. I don't think, it's like everybody says, oh, well, there's a good cop and there's a bad cop. But it's like the system as a whole is horrible. So even if you are a good cop, it doesn't matter because the system is whacked, right? And I say that whacked in a good way and in a bad way. Also too, when I was at the defund the police, it was so amazing to see so many people from different cultures, backgrounds, ages, you know, everywhere that were, you know, supportive of defunding the police, giving this money that, because the money in Toronto is ridiculous. And for them to get all this money, and your tactic for a wellness check is to drag a nursing student on the floor and put your foot on her neck, is to, you know, allow somebody to fall off of a 24 flight building, and then to also go into a man's house by a porch where he doesn't, English is not the first, and he.
Oh, you're breaking up again. Oh, did we lose Iye? Okay, we lost Iye again.
Oh,
I've taken off her video.
She's back. Hi, Iye.
Oh, yeah. Can you hear me better?
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Okay. So, my whole thing is I feel like we need to kind of highlight how many substance users and people that, you know, we like, you know, marginalized people have been impacted by the police. And maybe we need to start having campaigns that are rolling out about that, because there's not enough talk about people that have trauma with the police, and then there's a wellness check, and then you have 8 police officers show up, or 2, or 3, or 4.
We've lost you again, Iye. Iye, are you still there?
Yeah, I'm still here.
Okay, yeah. You just
So I'm still waiting for the day that I see a cop treating a white woman the same way that they have treated the nursing student, who I believe was a woman of color as well. And Regis, and all these people that have been impacted by the police. So I think that we need to come up with some sort of campaign to highlight the impact that the police has done to the substance use community and substance users. And I think that that would be really good. And I think that we would get a lot of response back from people, because a lot of people don't talk about that. And then again, they get arrested when they're under the influence, or, and it's just not.
Oh, we've lost you again, Iye. I think, Iye, are you there?
Yeah.
Okay. We're running. I'd like to get to Grace on this as well.
Okay, yeah.
Okay. And because we have one more question, and then we're going to have to wrap up in about 10 minutes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Hi, Don. I provided my answer at the very beginning, so we can jump into the next question if you'd like.
Okay, but the next question is really sort of the other side of this whole thing. How can we, there's lots of discussion about defunding the police, justice reform, prison abolition, these sorts of things. But what do the panelists have to say about reform within social work systems, mental health care systems, and the healthcare system more broadly? It's a very big question, so you'll have to just take a few minutes. We have about 10 minutes left to answer this question for 3 of us. So, it's the systems that we're dealing with now. In reality, it's not the utopian ones we want to see created, but maybe there's some beginnings in the answer to this question. So let's start with Emily this time.
All right. I will just quickly speak to my experience going through social work school. Much of the curriculum is outdated, and the current Canadian social work's ethical guidelines was developed in 2005, and we are still currently using the same principles and guidelines. If you read through them, you can find many oppressive things, because actually during one class one day, our job was to rip it apart. Versus if you compare it, because we've written scholarly articles comparing, if you compare the peer support model and their code of ethics and their guiding principles, it's a hell of a lot more appropriate than the social work ones are, ironically. Social work education in Newfoundland, it absolutely is not harm reduction based. It is far from, actually, and unfortunately this year they were the only faculty that did not allow us to come in and give harm reduction training and naloxone training to their students, despite the fact that I mean, Donald, we know some of the faculty there, but that in and of itself was not enough. It is extremely, it's kind of, it's very outdated and quite oppressive. And if I went by what I was taught and not necessarily sometimes what my gut tells me, I wouldn't be that good of a social worker, to be honest with you. So that's, I mean, I can only speak to that curriculum in and of itself, but there's not a lot of variety. It is not harm reduction focused, and our school still doesn't like it. The motto for Munn School of Social Work is get in and get out. And that's all I will contribute. And yeah. You're muted, Donald.
Sorry. Thank you, Emily. And thank you, Jay, for telling me that. Iye, in just a few minutes, could you talk about what you feel we need to start with reforming our social work, mental health care, healthcare systems more broadly? Where would you start?
I would have to say that, like Emily said, it's outdated. So again, like, everybody needs to be like trained in naloxone and overdose prevention. I feel also too that when it comes to stigma and, you know, diversity, that needs to be a huge thing. Again, like I said, we're all different. We can't heal the same. We can't get the same supports, or we shouldn't. Everybody's different. So I feel like it needs to be more individualized and more focused on the person, and maybe having kind of like a team where it's like you have one person for wellness, one person for mental health, one person for, you know, like your substance use. Like, it needs to be more team focused, because what I find is that when you have one person, and this is what happens, is that you get one worker who has 10 people on a caseload. How can they do all of this stuff? You know what I mean? Like, how can they really give the best of what they were taught in school and from lived experience with a caseload of 10 or 15 people? I feel like it should be more of a team. And yeah, that's my answer. More team focus based support.
Thank you.
To add on to, oh, sorry.
Thank you very much, Iye. Go ahead, Grace.
Thanks. One thing I'd really like to see is reform to the goose chase that a lot of people are sent on to access services from each of those systems. I realize that some places like Coast and the Burnaby Center for Concurrent Addictions and Mental Health are doing a great job at providing that safe bed where people can go in. They're not going to worry. They're not going to worry about people stealing their stuff when they're in. They have access to that mental health and to social work, and it's all kind of contained in this same space, instead of having to go all the way downtown to see your psychiatrist and then going all the way to East Van to pick up your methadone, and then needing to kind of commute these long distances and for long periods of time to access like really essential services that you need to function best. And it's disappointing because these places are so few and far between, but I think that that type of integration, it combined with reforming maybe outdated social work training curriculums are two approaches to that.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, it sounds like a lot of I guess the bigger problem is our drug policies are outdated. So we keep refining and reforming systems within the box of drug prohibition. So it's always, in some ways, we will never be able to get anything right as long as we keep, hammering people with the criminal law as one of our major tools for substance use. So that's sort of the conundrum we're in, and why organizations like ours are really trying to say, look, we need a restart. We need to start all over again, and clearly build systems for people who develop problematic issues with substances, but totally outside of a criminal justice system or criminal justice approach. We know most people who use drugs don't become severely addicted, develop severe problems. So it's sort of our age-old dilemma. We have one overriding major policy framework called drug prohibition that makes creating these systems really difficult, because the drugs are outside of our control, and much of the activity of the illegal system is outside our control, and our institutions, like the police, like the mental health system, stigmatizes the substances. So having said that, we clearly can make a lot of progress if we work together. I love your comment, Iye, about team-based approaches, working together, using everyone's skills, the way peers have been brought into the overdose prevention work, that peers are really people with lived and living experience, are really on the front lines of our overdose response. So that's how innovation is happening. New systems are being created within a larger dysfunctional system. I wanted to give Natasha a moment. Do you have any closing remarks, Natasha? CAPUD is the Canadian Association of People Who Use Drugs, is an incredibly important organization that has really emerged over the last number of years, and has built a number of very strong relationships with other NGOs, with some governments, and Natasha's leadership has been very important in and we look for ways of working together on a daily basis.
Thanks, Donald. Yeah, I agree with a lot of the panelists, well, almost everything that everybody's been saying. And I think I put it in the chat too, that a lot of the inequities exist because of ignorance and lack of understanding for the issues that people who use drugs face. And those are things that you can't teach. And that's why we need to empower people who use drugs to be able to deliver services, because we do have empathy for each other. We do have understanding of each other's issues. And so from my perspective, I don't think, along with legislation and regulation and decriminalization, these things are all needed. But along with that, we need to empower the populations of people we speak about in these conversations. And oftentimes that is the last voice that has a seat at the table. And that's sort of what CAPUD has been fighting for. And so I think today has highlighted a lot of the inequities that exist even in youth around consent. And a lot of youth are adults by not a choice of their own, because they have nobody else. And I think that that's a very important thing that we need to discuss in the landscape of policy and drug policy, because if we allow people to live outside and take care of themselves and we have no issue with doing that, then when do we have the right to take their consent away when they've been fending for themselves for many years and they are adults by every sense of the word? And so I think that talking with the youth, and these issues have been highlighted again around the consent piece, that needs to be talked about more broadly, and have youth at the table in more of these conversations as it relates to drug policy. So I could go on all day because you guys are all amazing people. I'll kick it back to Donald, and thanks everybody for coming.
Thanks, Natasha. It's a pleasure to work with you as usual. So Iye and Em and Grace, I really want to thank you. It's been an absolute honor and a pleasure to hear your perspectives, to hear your stories, to hear the work you're doing. I think everyone in the chat room has been saying how moved they are and how incredible this session has been. And I really want to thank you from the bottom of our hearts for the work you do and the resilience that you demonstrated in this session today. I'd also like to thank our co-organizers for the session, CSSDP, Erica, Matthew, Alex, and Kira. Been great working with you to put this event on. I know you're having a super busy day today with all the other stuff that's going on. I'd also really want to give a shout out to Sophie for our translation. She's a super translator, a super interpreter. She's apparently she has moved to a new house 2 days ago and just done 3.5 hours of simultaneous translation for us today. So you need to go and have a glass of wine maybe, or a massage or something, Sophie. So thank you so much for that. And also for to Kapud for organizing and keeping an eye on the chat. Natasha's getting very good at both moderating and chat watching. Chat sitting, maybe, like cat sitting. The hashtags for all of these events are hashtag support don't punish. We'll be sending out an evaluation via email. We'd love all the participants attendees to evaluate that. And also a shout out to Shay, who I can't see, she's Ms. Invisible, who has helped us technologically keep this train rolling. And what can I say? Thank you so much. And thank you for everyone for coming to all of those wonderful comments and amazing discussion going on in the chat room. And there's some resources there. Shay, do we save the chat? What do we do with the chat?
We do save the chat. And of course, if people are wanting to watch their question or watch themselves, this is all on YouTube right now. So you can go to the Paradigma, and we'll send out, when I send out the evaluation, I'll say, here is the link in case you or somebody you know missed some of it or want to check it out. And Natasha has a question.
I posted.
Oh,
You're muted.
Oh, sorry. Just when Donald said I was getting good, I screwed up. Anyway, I had posted a video in the chat a little while ago. It's a TED Talk, and it really speaks to the inequities that exist between race and gender and how that impacts people. So I would encourage everybody that's watching this to please watch that TED Talk. It had me in tears. It's absolutely amazing. And it really highlights the inequities that women of color face and the violence that they face as well. So please take a look if you get a chance. Thank you.
So now the most difficult time of all of these events, usually you stop an event and you yak with your fellow participants, and some of you might go have a cup of tea together or hug each other or everything. With Zoom, it's just over and we get kicked out of the Zoom room. So